that comic, you can easily distribute that for $15. Now you have to deal with the distribution, shipping, and printing and all the rest of it, but the profit margin per book is still significantly higher. And
For the moments come to my hand, I, Lion-O, commando, Thundercats, ho! And you're watching the Dorkening.
Everyone's sitting down now. Oh boy, that's really loud. Okay. This is the How to Get Into Comics panel. I believe that is the title of this thing.
the official title was Making a Career in Comics.
Making a Career.
Breaking into comics, we can do that too.
Yeah, we could do that too. All right. Well, I am your host, Sir John. I have a radio program on WESU. You can listen to that. It's called Pint of Comics. My guest today is Gamal Hennessy, who is very important. It's going to explain to you how to get into comics and how important it is to make that living properly. Tell me more about you, because I know very little, and I think these folks would like to hear it too.
Okay. My name is Gamal Hennessy. I am an attorney, author, and business consultant who specializes in the comic book industry. I've been in comics for the better part of 25 years. I started back in 1996, and I was the general counsel for a Japanese animation and manga company in New York City until Marvel decided they wanted to get back into the Japanese market. And it is very difficult to do because the Japanese negotiation is something that is very specific. You can't just pick up the phone like you could do with countries in Europe and Latin America. So I joined Marvel way back when Tobey Maguire was the only Spider-Man. And I was there for a couple years, and I realized very quickly that the vast majority of artists and writers who work for Marvel, because they all work freelance, they are not employees of Marvel, they all would get deals from Marvel, and I, as one of their representatives, would hand the contract to these creative people, say, take it to your lawyer, let me know what they think about it, and we can work out a deal. But I knew they didn't have a lawyer. They knew they didn't have a lawyer. They knew, and I knew, that they were going to sign whatever I put in front of them because I was Marvel, and they weren't, and they wanted to work at Marvel. So when I left Marvel, I started my practice specifically to help those people at least understand what it was that they were signing, so they're not just going off and signing away the valuable intellectual property rights that they're creating whenever they make the stories or the art for the comics. Now, as technology grew and as things started to open up for creative people in a lot of different industries, especially with the internet, my practice grew. So now what I'm doing is I'm helping people form their businesses and collaborate with each other around the world, and printing and distribution and marketing and all of those things, because at a certain point, I realized I was helping people with the legal side, but they still didn't necessarily understand how the business of comics worked. They didn't understand project management. They didn't understand distribution channels. They didn't even know what distribution channels were. So I now walk them through the entire thing. I actually published a book in 2020 called The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing, which actually walks you through the entire process of building your own comic book company, so that, well, if you look at a lot of the people who are like in Artist Alley and like they're building their businesses, they built those businesses primarily through trial and error.
Right.
And trial and error is expensive and emotionally draining, and nobody really wants to do it. So the book is to help you kind of get over those hurdles so that you can actually have more fun with what you want to do.
All right. What are the biggest changes that you've seen in the last 20 years?
Biggest changes in the last 20 years is easily the rise of high-speed internet.
Yeah.
Because with high-speed internet, it actually affects every aspect of the comic book business. Because to put together a team, you used to have to like find people in places like conventions or things like that and figure out how you were going to work together. And then if you worked in different places, people would have to mail things to each other or stuff like that. And it was a nightmare. Now, I have clients in, let's say, LA, and they're a writer. They'll hire an artist that's in Indonesia. The letterer will be in, somewhere in Europe, and they can collaborate in real time. At the same time, you can market your comic not to this wide general audience that may or may not want your particular story, and you can find the exact group of people. I don't know how many of you have ever read this very good book called The Long Tail, which actually identifies that no matter what you are making, there is a group of people who probably want it. The trick is finding those people and actually connecting with them so that you can actually sell your story. It's much easier to do that now than it was 20 years ago. At the same time, distribution is easier because you can do webtoons, you can do crowdfunding, you can do traditional direct market being the comic shops, you can do bookstore, you can do library, you can do any combination that you want, and you can have that fulfillment. Again, the printing could be done in Korea, the books come in to LA, you can have them shipped anywhere in real time in ways that 20 years ago, it wasn't even an option.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of very powerful tools out there for creators to use to build their own businesses. But if you don't understand how they work, it's like giving me a Lamborghini.
Right.
I haven't driven a car since 2009. It's not going to help me any, but because, I don't know what I'm doing.
Let me ask you about this. This came up, and I'm sure anybody here that's been on the former app known as Twitter, there was a Twitter thing going on about how comics broke me. Did you run into that?
Yes. It was related to a very unfortunate situation, a gentleman named Ian McGinty, who was very prominent in both animation and comics. He passed away, I think he was like 38 or something.
He was young, yeah.
And it wasn't officially announced what it is that took his life, but a lot of people speculated that he was extremely overworked and burnt out, because the reality is, if you're working in this kind of field and the amount you get per whatever the unit is, in comics, the basic unit of measurement when you're looking to get paid from a creative standpoint is called a page rate. If your page rate does not actually allow you to generate an income that is a livable wage, then you are forced to work far more than is humanly healthy to work, and you burn out. Either you A, run out of money, B, you have physical, mental, emotional damage. And a lot of what Comics Broke Me was talking about was all of the things that people had to deal with, the detrimental things that they did. Why? Because they wanted to make comics.
And that's why I think what you're doing is very important, to see all this kind of stuff that people were bringing up just because of this one person and all the things that they had to do to try and make a living. Can you explain what's important about what you're trying to teach people is to how to make a living wage doing the comic book industry? I mean, it seems to be really tough.
Well, when you look at the comic book industry, because a lot of people they have a very narrow view of what the comic book industry is. The comic book industry is actually any business that generates revenue, totally or partially, from the existence of narrative sequential art. Which means, and there's two ways that you can actually make money off of comics. You can make money directly because you make comics, or indirectly because you do something related to the comics. Direct kinds of revenue is independent comics, where you own everything, and you own the business, you own the property. Any profit that comes out is yours. But the downside to that is the business responsibility is also yours. So you can have the greatest comic ever, but if your business is bad, you still fail. You could have the best business model that anyone has ever seen, but if you don't have a comic, you have nothing to sell. And creative people don't really like to hear me say this, but this is actually 100% true. If your comic is not that good, but your business model is amazing, you still make a living in comics. You're not winning any Eisner Awards, but you can still make a living. Quality is a plus. It is not necessarily essential. Artists and writers hate that, but it's still true. The other side of independent comics is what's called freelance comics, where you work for another company and they pay you for the work that you do. If they pay you enough, or you make you generate enough work that you get a livable wage, then that is something that you can do. The problem is you have to find consistent work, because you're not, it used to be in the 80s and 90s, you could get onto a book and literally stay on that book for 30 years. Your Chris Claremonts, your John Burns, these people, they got one freelance job and that was like a 40-year career. Nowadays, every 3 months, 6 months, you have to go out and hustle to get a new job. If there's a dry spell, you're going to run into a problem, because now the money is not coming in, and it's difficult in that position to have a reserve, because you're barely making what it is that you need to survive in the first place. The third type of direct way to make money from comics is what's called a creator-owned deal. It kind of sits in between an independent deal and a freelance deal, in that you own some of the intellectual property, but the other piece is owned by the publisher, and you theoretically work together to actually get that book out into the world. The problem with that is you're only getting money from the royalties or the advance on that book. If there are no royalties or advance, you made a book and there is no money. If you get a bad deal from a publisher, it could be a lot of money and you don't get any of it. The third problem is to make a living as a creator-owned artist, you have to have enough royalties coming in every month from all of your deals to pay all of your bills. The problem there is it sometimes takes 4, 5, 10 years to get a deal.
Right.
And that deal, they're only going to pay you 2 years later when the profits roll in, and then they're only going to pay you on a quarterly basis.
Right.
So the idea of actually making a living off of that very sporadic income is not viable in many respects. Now, there's the indirect ways of making comics, which are actually far more lucrative than the direct ways, because you have licensing, investing, and what's called conglomerate work. So anytime you walk around and you see anybody with a t-shirt, a hat, a toy, a video game, socks, whatever, all of that, those products come from licensing. And licensing generates exponentially more money than actual comics. The problem is, if you have a character, if you own something that does not have a significant following to justify the licensing in the first place, you don't make any money. Once you cross that tipping point, whether it's Spider-Man or Calvin and Hobbes or anything, then you don't have to do anything anymore. Except once in a while you got to put out new stories, but at that point, when I was working at Marvel, I was there when Eric Bana played the Hulk. Ang Lee movie. You probably didn't see it, it's fine. But Marvel didn't make that movie. Marvel licensed those rights out to Universal. But we held on to the merchandise rights. So there were these things called Hulk hands. Hulk hands were the most amazing toy ever created. They were big green hands, or about that big. And they were like gloves, but they were just fists, because he was a Hulk. And you stick your hand in there, and then when you hit anything, it would make all sorts of noises. Everyone in the Marvel office had these hands, and very little work done got for like weeks, because it was just, it was amazing. But we made, I think the license fee for the film was like maybe $250 million. The revenue generated from the merchandise was close to $1 billion. The comic itself made, I don't know, 100,000, 110,000. At that point,
The copy amounts were 110,000.
yeah,
roughly.
at that point, it is actually, when you're talking about conglomerate comics like Marvel, DC, things like that, there's the difference between those companies and, like, if I started a comic book company, I have to generate revenue from the comics. And if the comics don't sell, I don't make money. If Marvel doesn't sell a whole lot of any comic, they don't care, because it's almost like the cross between a R&D project where they're trying to figure out which stories are going to like land and what art is going to be best for the merchandise, and a marketing project where they're basically just continuing their connection with the fan base. So if the movie makes $1 billion and the merchandise makes $2 billion, the fact that the comic book made 100,000 or 200,000, who cares? Because
It's a loss leader.
exactly.
Yeah.
But the difference between comic book marketing, the way I define comic book marketing, and regular marketing is always a cost in a business. In comic book marketing, it's actually a revenue stream.
Sure.
Because they're charging us to market to us so that we will actually feel the emotional connection, because that's how merchandising works. You will not go out and spend $30 for a $10 shirt unless you have an emotional connection to the $30 shirt. If I put a bat symbol on the shirt, you now have an emotional connection to it, not because of the shirt, but because Bruce Wayne's parents died.
Interesting. When it comes to the way comics are paid out these days, are you seeing like a difference in what people are making now compared to 20 years ago? Are the page rates lower or are they higher?
The page rates have not actually been adjusted for inflation.
Oof.
Number one. Number two, because comics is what's called a geographically dispersed medium of creation, the publishers can go to any country in the world to source talent. The key to sourcing talent from any country in the world is the cost of living in other countries is exponentially lower in many places. So if you go to India, Indonesia, Nigeria, the Philippines, and let's say you were going to pay an American artist $100 a page, you could turn around and pay the Philippine artist $30 a page, and for their cost of living, you are now paying them more.
Right.
So there's very little incentive to actually raise page rates, and the primary reason for that is comic book creators love comics, and that love is actually leveraged against them in terms of all negotiations. If someone comes into, when I was in Marvel, somebody comes into my office and I knew they grew up reading Spider-Man, they're wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt, they got a Spider-Man backpack, I can pretty much tell they want to draw Spider-Man.
Right.
So when you talk to like a hedge fund banker, the hedge fund banker does not love what's in the hedge fund. He loves the money. That's why he's a hedge fund manager. A person who's doing comics loves comics, and they will make business and legal decisions based on their love of comics, which is often going to be detrimental to them long term. What I try to teach people is don't give up your love for comics. You don't have to be a cutthroat mercenary to be in comics, because in most cases it's not going to help you anyway. But understand what it is that you are, what your motivation is and why you're doing it and what you want to achieve, and that will actually help you make decisions informed by your emotional attachment to these things, because it's one thing for someone to be emotionally attached to a character they grew up with, but if they created that character, now they are completely invested in that, and they want to make sure that they can actually develop that the way they want to develop it, and they love that because of that, connection they have to the creation, which also leads to bad business and legal decisions. So
When it comes to creator-owned stuff, are you finding that the corporate company, like Marvel and DC, let's just call them out for what they are they even doing creator-owned stuff anymore, or they're just done completely?
no,
Yeah.
there is very little value to them to do creator-owned projects, because the entire value, if you look at the quarterly report from Marvel and DC, in the prospectus it will say the value of the company is in the 5,000 characters they own. In their mind, they don't need any new characters.
Right.
They've got enough characters, and when writers come in to do books, the way they get more characters is the writers will say, well, I'm going to do X-Men and I have this great idea for these 3 new mutant characters. And Marvel will say, great, here's what's called a new character agreement. The new character agreement will transfer all the intellectual property rights for that character to Marvel. You will now be giving up the character that you created. And if 10 years from now that character is in a movie, you may or may not get what's called a residual, which is back-end participation for whatever the character is used for. That way, Marvel continues to generate their most valuable asset, their intellectual property, without doing anything.
Right.
So what I usually advise my freelance clients to do is what I call the Frank Miller method. Frank Miller, for those of you who are not aware, was very influential in the 80s doing runs on Daredevil and Batman. Like Dark Knight Returns is one of his seminal works. But he did a very interesting thing, and Todd McFarlane did the same thing. They did a very significant run on a licensed property as a freelancer. Frank Miller worked on Daredevil, but then they went out and did a creator-owned property, which if you strip away, if you just add in the Marvel characters, it's the same story.
Right.
Sin City and Daredevil is the same story. Miho and Elektra are the same characters, but Miho belongs to Frank Miller. Elektra he made and had to give to Marvel because he put it in Daredevil. The difference is when the Sin City movies got made, that went to Frank Miller. Right. That didn't go to Marvel. If you look, and this is just my personal opinion, but Spawn is nothing more than Spider-Man and Doctor Strange mushed together. And McFarlane did a lot of work on Spider-Man and could have at any point introduced Spawn into Marvel. But if he did that, Spawn would not be the longest running independent comic book in the Guinness Book of World Records, and Todd McFarlane would not have millions of dollars. So there's a path that is actually becoming more and more prevalent in comics, and it is to get into comics, the easiest thing to do is go make a comic, because that'll actually teach you 4 things at the same time. It'll teach you, 1, how the business works, the entire business, not just the creative aspect. Number 2, it will teach you whether or not you want to be in comics at all, because if you find out, oh, this is horrible, I never want to do this again, you can just go back to reading comics. 3, it'll actually give you a network of people, because comics is a very small industry. So if you know 8 people, you actually know 80 people, which means you actually know 800 people, which means you actually probably know everybody within 3 degrees of separation. And the 4th is you will know the difference between a good deal and a bad deal, and you will have proof that you can finish something, because there's thousands and thousands of people who want to create comics who never finish anything. The industry needs to see that you can finish. You have the book that you did, that can get you freelance work. The freelance work can actually raise your profile and your social proof in the industry so that you can go out and either make your own book or get a much better creator-owned deal. And over time, that is one of the better ways to build a career. It's not the only way, but it is a way that actually utilizes a lot of different aspects of the process to get you where you want to go.
Sure. I'll be direct here. Of all the companies that are out there now, what's the best business model for someone getting into the industry? Is it say Image's business model or one of the smaller companies?
No, it is not Image's business model. The best model that I think is actually going right now for someone who wants to break in, and if you know you want to do independent work, not necessarily freelance, the best business model is to build your own company and utilize something like Kickstarter for your distribution, because that allows you several things at once. 1, you have direct access to your fan base without having to jump through the hoops of another publisher or an agent or you don't have to give up any rights. It is your business. Then it allows you to own the intellectual property. It allows you to charge a premium pricing for your comics, because as many of you know, the cost of a 22-page issue at this point is about $5. But if you release it on Kickstarter, that comic, you can easily distribute that for $15. Now you have to deal with the distribution, shipping, and printing and all the rest of it, but the profit margin per book is still significantly higher. And if you continuously crowdfund, several things could happen. One, your business grows organically. I have quite a few clients that's their main business model, because once you release on Kickstarter, you can then go to the direct market, you can then go to bookstores, you can then get secondary revenue streams, and you can start to explore merchandise and other things like that. The other thing that can happen is enough people see you that you get offered freelance gigs from larger companies. You get offered creator-owned deals from other companies because they see that they can take your intellectual property that you already developed, they didn't have to pay for, and they can put it into their catalog and get you more revenue streams. So right now, I think if you want to be independent, that's the way to go. If you want to do freelance, you should still make a comic, because that's still going to give you that education and that calling card that you can then use to leverage into work. But you can transition out of that quickly and start to do freelance. And when I say freelance, I don't just mean Marvel, DC. There are about roughly 300, 400 different comic book companies out there. Anything from one individual all the way up to like Kodansha, which is tens of thousands of people. And the independents who are building their own comic book companies, they need freelance people too, because in many cases they cannot or they don't want to do everything themselves. And that can be just as lucrative and just the much faster turnaround than banging on Marvel's door for like 2 or 3 years to get like a 6-page thing that you may not get any more work.
The last few years, we've gone through a lot of changes in the industry, of course. We all know what that was. Distribution has changed considerably.
Yes.
How is that affecting your clients?
The larger clients that were, well, just to give a little bit of background, prior to 2019, for about 20, 30 years, there was one major source of distribution into the direct market. That was Diamond. If you couldn't get your book into the Diamond catalog, you could get your stuff into comic book shops, but then you had to do like door-to-door consignment and things like that. It was a mess. Up until 2019, it was Diamond. Then when COVID hit, Diamond shut down. After Diamond shut down, when they reopened, they reopened to a completely new world, because now there were 4 other major distributors already in place to compete for that business. You had Simon & Schuster, you had Lunar, you had Penguin Random House, and there was some weird thing that Midtown Comics was doing where they were trying to be a distributor too, but whatever that was. And the weird thing is, a lot of publishing companies simply left Diamond. Because they had been the only game in town for about 30 years, they didn't do anything to innovate, improve, or do whatever, because they're like, well, why should we? This is why you should. And now there's the larger companies that I work with, they do like some of their books, like the bookstore market, they'll do through Simon & Schuster. And then the direct market, maybe they'll do through Lunar. And then their back catalog, they might do through Diamond. So it gives them a lot more options, and there's a lot more competition for better rates, because Diamond, like if a book is $5, the publisher is really, in the best case scenario, getting $1.60 if you go through Diamond, because Diamond takes their cut, the comic book shop takes their cut, the jobbers take their cut. But if you have competition, some of my clients are now, it's $2 a book or $2.10, and that may not seem like a lot for one book. It's like 50, 60 cents, but when you're talking tens of thousands of books every month over a year's period, it turns into significantly more revenue, potentially, especially, like I said before, if a lot of new books are coming in that are already, the production cost has already been paid because they've already been kickstarted, then there's a lot more potential for revenue if you find the right distribution mix.
I actually think the distributor wars of the 90s were one of the worst things to happen to comics as a whole, especially for the creators. So seeing these new revenue streams for any publisher, independent, self-published or otherwise, is a really good thing. Has it been a benefit?
It has been a benefit as long as the comic book creator is willing to be more than a comic book creator. Because I have clients, they just want to write. They want to write the story, they want to hand it off to the rest of the creative team, and they want the publisher to take care of the rest. That's not how life works, especially in comics, because the comic book creator themselves has to go out and do the marketing for the book. You have to understand what marketing is. You have to go through the marketing process, and it's a multiple year kind of thing. You cannot, if I wrote a comic in January and the comic book's coming out in March, I cannot tell people about it in April because it's too late. Even if you look at things like movies, a movie will get greenlit in January. They will tell you in January. The movie's not coming out till 2025, but they're going to keep telling you about it and keep getting. They'll have the stars on the talk shows. Well, when there's not a SAG strike, they'll have there'll be things written into everybody's contract to boost the idea of this movie, so that by the time the movie does come out, you make your Barbie, you make $500 million in a couple weekends. But you have to start early, and if you're the writer and you don't want to do that, it's going to be very difficult for you to take advantage of these new revenue streams, because crowdfunding is the easiest concept in the world. If you don't have a crowd, you get no funding. Right? So yes, it is a benefit if you're willing to get into that process and figure out printing, figure out distribution, figure out just project management as a whole. Because if you never get the finished pages, it doesn't matter how good your marketing is, because again, if you have no book, you can't sell what you don't have. So if the creator is willing to actually think like a publisher, and the product is their own stories, there's going to be a definite benefit, because there's a lot of options out there for what they can do.
We have creatives in the audience, anybody that wants to be a creative. So this guy is telling a lot of really good information. This is the first time meeting you, and I'm really pleased to hear this. You're telling some incredible information up here.
That's why people keep me around.
Well, it's a good reason. So listen to him. He's got some incredible information for you, and please, if we have any questions or anything, come on up to the mic, and we'll go from there. But we'll keep talking, because
We can keep talking. I can
there's
talk all
plenty
day.
of things to talk about. I got a whole million questions for you. So you've been doing this for 20 years. Now you're on your own. Generally, how many clients do you get in the time period? Can I ask that without?
Yeah. You
know?
can ask how many. You just can't ask who they are.
I'm not going to ask.
Well, there's different things that I'm doing to help people in different ways. I have specific legal clients that I work with either on a one-time basis or on an ongoing retainer. And any one-time clients, I usually get between 8 and 10. And the ongoing clients, I have probably about 24. The thing about comic book law and practicing comic book law is there's only like 12 or 15 of us in the country that do it independently. And we all know each other. We all go drinking together. It's great. It's fantastic. But the other thing that I do is I have a organization called Comics Connection that I co-run. And that actually is an online community that helps people build business models for their comics.
Oh, very nice.
So as people come into the organization, we figure out what they're trying to achieve, what they want to do. We have lessons, we have live Q&A sessions, we bring in experts from different fields to actually help people kind of figure out, well, this is what I want to do, this is how I can. So instead of that trial and error that I talked about earlier, and instead of that kind of isolation of feeling like they don't know who they can turn to or how they can actually get to where they want to go, we provide all of that in one very neat package. And for those, we have like a few hundred of those, because there's quite a few people who are trying to build their own business models, and they may not necessarily need the legal piece right now, because a legal piece is just one part of like a very large process. But whatever it is that they need, we can actually help them at any point in the process.
Lovely. Gotta love it. Go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering how the rise of webtoons are really affecting comics, and also whether or not you can apply the stuff you're talking about to making webtoons, and also just making like those paper versions of the webtoons.
Yeah, the print conversions. Webtoons is actually become a extremely powerful distribution option in terms of all of the other distribution. Because I was primarily talking about before was print distribution, but online distribution had stagnated for quite some time because it was not generating revenue. Digital distribution is actually superior to print distribution in getting the books to the client, to the reader, because you don't have to pay for printing, you don't have to pay for shipping. Your actual cost to get the book out is much lower, but the revenue stream is also so much lower that it doesn't, for a lot of companies, it doesn't make sense to do digital distribution except as a marketing exercise, except when you're talking about Webtoon, because the Webtoon model allows you, if you get a certain number of viewers that are follow you, or you get a certain number of views on your comic on a regular basis, Webtoons will start to give you money. They will split some of the advertising revenue with you. And if you cross another threshold, you get, I think it's called their Canvas deal, where they pick up a piece of the intellectual property, but they give you a significant advance. They also put you into their print pipeline. They have a development studio for film and television, and your stuff gets into that pipeline. And if your book gets optioned and purchased for a film, there is significant money coming from that in the tune of 6 figures. So if you're going to do, the difference between doing print comics and webtoons is in the delivery, because webtoons is a vertical scroll and print comics is a traditional page turning format. But there are ways, and there's a lot of people who are production designers now who specialize in converting webtoons to print. So you can start out in webtoon, and especially if you want to build a following to do something like crowdfunding or to get a webtoon deal, you can go start in webtoons, drive your traffic to webtoons in your marketing, and then use that to springboard any other kind of work you're doing without having to worry about print.
It's pretty good. I think Webtoons is a real nice thing to go to with some of these creators. So.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You had another question?
Well, I was wondering with the paper conversions, even if you make a audience on Webtoon, I feel like a lot of people aren't going to be willing to actually spend money on something that that you can get online for free.
Well, the evidence actually suggests otherwise. The evidence suggests that people, once they read something and they get that emotional connection with it, they start to actually gather up all of the artifacts related to that thing that provides the emotional connection. So if they read the webtoon online, if you look at something like Lore Olympus, hundreds of thousands of people read Lore Olympus online for free. And it still became a New York Times bestseller because, well, one of two things happened. One, the people who read the webtoon still went out and bought the graphic novel. Or two, people who don't read webtoons, because they're separate audiences, suddenly found this thing and they bought it. So you're not necessarily going to lose an audience because you give some or all of your story away for free, as long as you give them something different when you try to sell it to them.
Okay, so as long as you can build a connection, people will still be willing to pay for the...
Oh yeah.
Oh, there's diehard fans out there.
Oh yeah.
Just some of us, anyway.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
That was good. Come on up.
Hi, thank you. I've actually, this past May, I've actually self-published my own comic. It's animal-based and fantasy. I know you were saying that you have to go out there and you have to find your audience for that. I just don't see too many animal comics out there that seem to make it, you know?
Well, have you ever heard of Usagi Yojimbo?
Yes,
Have you ever heard of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles?
they made it.
Yeah, that's two. And I just, I mean, I read a lot of comics. So I can just pull them out of the air. But the idea in marketing, what we try to teach is that to understand how to market your comic, you have to understand who your ideal reader is. It's a concept that Stephen King did in his book on writing. And basically, there's 5 factors. There's the demographics, psychographics, generation, and genre of your book. The answer to who your ideal reader is in your book. Once you actually deconstruct your book, you can actually find out who the ideal reader is, and that's going to be a theoretical construct. But those people who fit that profile have already collected themselves in groups online. They're on Facebook, they're on Reddit. Go to Facebook, animal fantasy, comic, or just leave comic out, because the idea is people are interested in the message, not necessarily the medium. So if you have a story that is animal fantasy, like Watership Down or Animal Farm or Usagi Yojimbo, those groups already exist online. If you join those groups, become a valued member of those groups, and then once you are accepted, you introduce the idea of your comic, they will gravitate towards your comic naturally, because those are the types of stories they wanted to read in the first place. That's your marketing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Next question.
Anybody else? I have more.
Okay, you have more?
Since bring up the animal thing. Oh no, go ahead, run up there, because I can wait on my question. It's no big deal.
Which one?
You sound like you have a lot of questions. You're like trying to sort through them.
Yeah, I mean, we came a little bit late, but in terms of copyright, are you looking to copyright early a concept, or does it matter to copyright a concept, especially if you're working like with world building and stuff, like, something that's gonna be difficult for somebody to like just kind of like carbon copy, but like, should I still be worried about like pieces of it being copyrighted?
The primary value, is one of the things I said in the beginning, of a comic book company or a comic book individually is the intellectual property embedded in that comic. Your best bet, everyone's best bet, is to copyright your comic as soon as possible. As soon as you have your idea in what's called a fixed medium of expression, which means you wrote it down or you drew it, you should actually copyright that. The magic is you can copyright it online, and it only costs $65, and you don't need an attorney, and it is best to copyright what's called the latest and best version. So if right now you have a couple notes on a napkin and a doodle that you did on like a whiteboard, take a picture of it, copyright it. Because once you actually have the script, you can copyright, you can update your copyright. Once you have the comic comes out, you can update the copyright. The earlier that you have the copyright, the more protection that you have. The length of the copyright does not change the earlier that you do it, because the length of a copyright is your life plus 70 years. So whenever you have it, whatever you have now, copyright it.
All right.
Do you need to know the difference between copyright and trademark?
I mean, I do in effect, sort of, more or
It's
less,
important.
as it applies to other. I actually came from a music publishing background, so I find that very little of it translates.
Yeah,
It doesn't, really, in terms of like the trademark chain and the copyright chain, it's like they use the same words, but it's really not quite the same.
No.
So
not at all.
I mean, yeah, the differences between trademarking and copyright. Same question. Should I trademark early on, especially if I have like a logo or
You
some stuff
don't
like that?
necessarily, well, the thing about trademarking comics is a little weird relative to trademarking other things. To trademark a comic, you have to have 2 or more issues of the comic available for sale to the public,
Okay.
which means if you try to trademark like that those sketches and that doodle that I talked about, they're not going to accept that because they're like, what is this? But if once you have, because you have to have a series, you can't trademark a first issue. But once you're in the process of making your comics, that is probably when you should trademark, because the difference between a copyright and a trademark is the copyright covers the ideas in the fixed medium of expression. So the stories, the characters, and everything else that you put into your comic. The trademark is the words or symbols used to sell things to people. So the easiest way I've figured out how to do this, if I wrote a story about a rich young man who survives a tragic, violent criminal event and then uses his money to gain these skills and, resources to fight crime outside the law as a vigilante, that's a story. It may not be the most original story that you ever heard.
I think I've heard it on.
You may have heard it once or twice. But that story can be copywritten. The magic part of that is you don't know what story I just made, because it could be Batman or Moon Knight or Green Arrow or Iron Man or Iron Fist or Nighthawk, because every one of those stories is the same story. But everyone has its own copyright. That's the copyright. Now, if we take my great news story and we say, well, this guy has some kind of animal fetish for whatever reason, right? And he decides he's going to put an animal on everything that he owns. And the publisher then takes that same symbol and puts it on everything that's not nailed down and sells it. Those are trademarks. The bat symbol is a trademark. The S is a trademark. It's not coincidental that all of the character, or the vast majority of characters that came out in the 50s and 60s had some kind of symbol on their chest because we need to sell some stuff. The trademark sells the stuff. The copyright is the story that makes people want to buy the stuff in the first place. You can't trademark something unless you actually have a few issues, but the copyright needs to be done as early as possible. Therein lies the difference between a copyright and a trademark, told in a completely neutral way without any reference to any specific character that anyone has ever heard of.
Those issues, do those have to be, like sequential?
They don't have to be sequential.
Do they have to be the same media? So could you do one like a paperback, staple bound, and then do another one online, or?
You can do, as long as it's not the same issue, you can do one as a digital release and one as a print release.
Okay, and that counts.
Because what the trademark office is, they want to show, you need to show what's called proof of use in commerce. All that really translates into is you take a PDF screenshot of the sale page on your website that says this comic is available for sale, and they go, well, that's use in commerce, and then they give you a trademark.
Gotcha. Perfect. Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
You had a question? Back again.
Yeah, sorry. So, I'm a part of this Discord server that basically is supposed to. It's owned by this publisher, Voice Me.
Never heard of.
It's a webtoon. Anyway, they offer to let you pitch to them and or at least practice pitching and all that stuff. And I'm wondering whether or not that's just a way for them to, I don't know, just steal your ideas if you haven't trademarked anything.
What are the rules in the Discord server? What do they say about intellectual property and the ideas that you post on the server? I would suggest taking a look at them to see who actually owns what gets put on the server, because this raises two issues. Issue one, the publisher could actually be using the Discord server just as a idea farm, right? Or they could have very noble intentions for the server, but everyone else on the server, if it's a server that a lot of people join, they could just take the idea. Now, if you copyright it before you put it on the server, it doesn't make a difference, because as long as you're monitoring for any type of potential infringement, it's going to be much harder for them to abscond with your idea. But if they're just put up a Discord server saying, pitch me all your ideas. Oh, what? No.
Yeah. The thing works is like if you pitch ideas, if they like what you do, they might be willing to make try to make a webtoon with you.
When you say try to make a, well, okay, here's something that I've actually
they'll try
noticed
to-
about Webtoon in the past 2 years. Webtoon used to be a thing where a creator could get a team together or by themselves, make a book, make a Webtoon, make it popular on Webtoon, and then Webtoons gives them a deal, and then they go off and, happily ever after. Now there are companies kind of inserting themselves into the process, saying, we will manage your Webtoon for you. We will pitch it to Webtoon. We will do this, that, and the third. That's not actually how Webtoon works. You do not need someone to act like Diamond for you to get your Webtoon on Webtoon. You can just put your Webtoon on Webtoon. Why do I need this other company to take a piece of the profit and potentially the ownership of the intellectual property when they didn't do anything?
Well, apparently the thing is for its own independent website that's technically now Webtoon, but yeah, I think I see your point.
If they have an independent website that is not Webtoon, and they have they have the numbers, the traffic on their website, so that it's better for you to put it on their site than Webtoon, then okay. I highly doubt that that's the case. Never heard of them before, but I tend to be skeptical of these things. Law school teaches you that.
Okay, thank you.
It's kind of a
You're
good
welcome.
point, though. I mean, how many new places like this are popping up these days? Are you finding more standard publishers, or are you finding more web design or internet-based digital platforms?
The MCU created a minor problem in that a lot of companies or a lot of people decided that the model they were going to have for their publishing company is what I refer to as the maybe movie model. Maybe movie model works like this. We're going to make comics. The comics are not going to make any money. In fact, we're going to lose money on the comics. However, because everybody knows comics are going to be made into movies now, which is actually not the case. The vast majority of comics will never be a movie or a TV show or anything else, just because there are thousands of comics that come out every month. If one movie project gets announced every day, that's 365 new comic book projects, which is a lot. But if there's still 12,000 comics that come out in a year, the vast majority of them will never be movies. And the ones that are actually being greenlit now are properties that came around in the 60s and the 70s. You are competing with 80 years worth of comic book material. And by the way, there are still screenwriters who are just making movies that are not based on comic books. So the idea that you're going to make a comic book that's going to lose money because no one buys it, but then Netflix is going to call you and give you money, that's not a business model. However, dozens of companies got venture capital and huge names in the business to buy into the maybe movie model until the money ran out. So if you look at companies like Aftershock, and if you look at companies like Action Lab, and you look at companies even like Heavy Metal, which tried to go deep into this concept, they are either bankrupt, they're failing, or they're on their last leg. Even companies that had movie deals, like an IDW, they had several deals for TV and movies and everything else, but the amount of money coming in from those deals cannot justify 5, 10, 15 years of losses. So you still don't have any money. The maybe movie model is one of the things that is the biggest, there has been the biggest trend in new comic book companies outside of companies that are using primarily the crowdfunding model to actually make revenue and make a profit.
I ran into that. During COVID, people were doing a lot of seminars over the interweb and all that kind of stuff just to I took one course with a writer who I was really interested just to talk to rather than get any kind of business information or anything. But his big point was selling the IP. Make something to sell the IP. And it kind of bothered me a little. As a longtime comic book fan, I don't want someone to make product. I want something that I'm going to enjoy. But he's more about, let's make this thing and then sell it to some TV or movie company. And that's what he was pushing. Is that how big of a problem is that? I mean, you did say it was kind of a problem.
It's only, well, it is a problem because a lot of the companies that worked on this maybe movie model were creator-owned publishers. So what they did was they said, we have a company that we're going to use to, we basically, in the industry, we call them an IP farm. We're going to have other people spend their time, sweat, and emotional energy making intellectual property. We will acquire it for little or no money up front. Then we will wait for Netflix to call us and we will sell them this intellectual property that we never actually promoted, and the books have failed, and we may not have even put out a book. And then when Netflix gives us the money, we will not give the creator the money, and that will be that's our business.
Right.
And business doesn't work.
Have there been successful ventures of that nature? I mean, other than Marvel, obviously.
Well, like I said, IDW had some books that, like Winona Earp,
right.
And there was a couple of Rucka's stuff, like Whiteout became TV series. Bendis had a couple of series. Mark Millar sold Millar World lock, stock, and barrel to Netflix. That worked. However, he had, I guess, 15 different properties. 5 of them were already successful, and he got a deal where he had like what's called a first look deal. So any new project he comes up with or that he brings to the studio, they have a deal where they get to look at it first in exchange for some money.
Yeah.
So in those cases where someone like Millar, who's been in it for 20 years and actually went through like I said before, went freelance, started to do his own thing, then started to get other properties, that model works. But the idea of just random comic book A is going to be a Netflix series, that's not a business.
I've seen far too much of that too. And again, are they selling these things? They're not really selling for a decent contract either. It's like a low upfront, and then maybe when the movie gets made, they get a bigger cut of it.
From a creator's perspective, if you go into a creator-owned deal, out of the 3 business models that exist, the creator-owned deal is the most dangerous business model because because in an independent thing, if you create a book and the book doesn't sell, well, okay, that's fine. You don't get any money. If you're freelance, you get paid up front. So if the book doesn't sell, you don't care because you made your money.
Right.
In a creator-owned deal, you can make the intellectual property. The book could make huge amounts of money, and you don't get any of it, depending on the contract you signed and the deal that you did. The thing that the most egregious aspect of the comic book business now, I believe, is in the creator-owned space, because that is where publishers are basically waylaying creators who spend 3 or 4 years trying to get anyone interested in their comic. And then when someone says, we will publish your comic, they are over the moon, and the last thing they want to do is have somebody like me tell them the contract is horrible, they shouldn't sign it.
Right.
And a lot of times they sign it anyway, okay, and then either the company will fail and they can't get their rights back because the intellectual property is trapped in that failed company, or it does well and they still don't get any money. It's not a good look.
Is that the worst deal you've run into at this point? Is the
No,
creator
the worst deal that I've run into was a freelance deal that basically said, and I quote, we are going to give you a page rate of $100. This is in 2020.
Okay.
Page rate of $100 for however many pages you do. However, we are going to withhold your payment until 80% of the United States is vaccinated against COVID. Now, if you think about that for a minute, you're like, okay, it's 2020. We don't have a COVID vaccine. The artist has no impact on creating a COVID vaccine. There is no relationship between the pages I gave you and the COVID vaccine. There is no mechanism for you to determine outside the CDC who is vaccinated and what percentage of America is vaccinated with a vaccine that at that point didn't exist. So why on earth are you holding on to my page rate until 80% of America is vaccinated?
That's insane.
That is the worst deal that I've ever seen.
Please tell me no one signed that.
Oh, a lot of people signed it.
See, that's where you get into that fans first kind of thing, and they want to write.
Creators love comics, and they will make poor decisions based on their love of comics. But the COVID thing, I mean, that's just dumb.
I won't even ask who wrote that thing. That's a bad look. What else can you tell these fine folks?
I could tell them that we're out of time because it's 12:59.
Well, that was really entertaining and very informative. I don't know about the rest of you folks, but that was really good. I hope you learned something.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Excelsior!